Chapter 1. A Wagon Filled with Paladins. I am the bard who remembers all the works of the mighty men of old, their great deeds, and the things which they accomplished. The wagon rolled down the narrow path between the mountains, passing on beyond the realms of civilization into forgotten places now writhing beneath the yoke of chaos. It was one among many, colonists chasing the myths of lands blessed with eternal summer. None could know it yet, but this wagon contained the most significant cargo of all, for upon the five sitting in that wagon the fate of these lands would turn. First among the company was Cazador Glamdring, the Dragonborn, so massive his scaled head scraped the top of the covered wagon. Fearsome was his visage, a scarlet face to fix in a permanent scowl, two icy blue eyes piercing through the road ahead. He sat with armor donned, a coat of chain that reached down to his boots, with a breastplate, gauntlets, greaves, and pauldrons to reinforce it. A dull brown cape hung about his shoulders to keep out the chill, though it had become far less needed in the past few days. A tabard was about his waist, and near it two silver axes hung. On his breast a symbol of the same, two axes crossed in a guard, gleamed proudly in the morning light. Opposite him sat a woman enwrapped in a bearskin cloak. Beneath it her armor gleamed, a coat of plates, though of different make than any seen in these lands. At her hip was a morning star mace, blunt and crude. A shield was bound upon her arm, with the image of a flaming sphere surrounded by feathered wings around it. Her hood was drawn up, her eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Neither hood nor cloak could conceal her heritage, though. Scarlet skin showed in the gaps between the armor. The hood caught on twisted horns, like some bastard offspring of a goat and elk. Her tongue was forked, her eyes pools of gleaming gold. She sat upon a thick, muscular tail, coiled beneath her, and she wore no boots, for none were made for cloven hooves. To whom did the tiefling pray? Further into the shadows sat a quiet man, clad in plate of unremarkable make and entirely forgettable craft. He wore no symbols, and no sign of his body could be seen, not even his face, for it was hidden beneath a tall, proud, Templar helm, or a weaponized bucket, depending on how you look at it. Might have seemed just another freelance seeking his next payment, if not for the sword he wore upon his back. The blade was massive, nearly as tall as the man himself. It was a work of beauty, a shining steel blade, a two-handed leather grip, and for the crossguard, a gilded pair of angel's wings in the form of the Aquila. None had seen the knight's face, for he slept alone and ate alone, and none dared to sneak upon him to spy his face. All anyone knew of him that his name was Julian Tyran, and he was not to be bothered. He had a certain aura about him, a presence that inspired both a cautious respect and a tense unease. Perhaps that was why he was sat in the cart with the dragon and the devil. Out in the sunlight, sat near the driver, and chatting amicably with him was one who sat with the dragon and the devil, not out of the caravan master's fear, but rather his own curiosity. A small fellow with curly brown hair on the tops of his head and his feet, no more than 4 feet high, with a pleasant, cheery face, brightened by bright hazel eyes. His skin was tanned and wrinkled by laugh lines and more years in the sun than his youthful eyes would sing. Peregrine the halfling sat with his feet up, telling a story, his iron skullcap next to him. In his belt were two short swords with unusual white hilts. He was wearing a chain shirt and padded pants, with a black tunic over all of it. The tunic had a symbol upon it, two white swords crossed in the same manner as the dragonborn's axes. He spoke with a relaxed and easy air of things inconsequential and pleasant, such as the blueness of the sky, the warmth of the sun, and the sights the birds must see. He was only somewhat disappointed that the others in the cart didn't feel like chat. Alongside the cart, Yindri Silverthorn walked and listened. A fair elven woman, with skin as pale as the moon, and hair just as pale that came down to her knees. She was also clad in light chain, with a tunic over it. A bow of white yew was upon her back, and a quiver at her hip. Next to it rode a saber with a hawthorn hilt, and in her leather boot was a sharpened dagger. She listened to the halfling speak and smiled. hearing the passage of the wind and the flapping of distant bird wings as well. She was also the first to hear the sound of running feet, ragged breathing, the snarling of wargs, and the cackling of goblins. Ahead, she, and Peregrine as well, saw a pair of scouts running back with two large lupine creatures on their tails. Small humanoids with green skins rode on their backs, whirling crude scimitars. Goblins! Wolf riders! Peregrine called to the rest of the riders. I'm going up to help. Wargs, not wolves, Gendry corrected him, as she also got moving towards the front, unslinging the long yew bow from her back. Does it matter, lassie? They're goblins! Shoot 'em! Cazador responded, climbing out of the cart, axes springing to his talons. Sincat and Julian followed after wordlessly, readying their mace and greatsword respectively. Peregrine rushed up and hit a warg with a stone from his sling, ordering the caravan back. Gendry followed closely beside him. A bow twanged, a warg got an arrow in the knee, slowing the beast. The goblins shot back, poorly. Their arrows fell short by a dozen yards. The wargs closed on the scouts and knocked one down. Cazador rushed forwards, and the massive dragonborn vanished in a puff of mist. In an instant he reappeared to slam his axe into the first warg's mouth, throwing it off the scout. Sincat dashed to get between the other scout and the next warg, while Julian took a pot shot with his crossbow, the shot going wide. Peregrine drew his swords and leapt up on the warg's back, kicking off one goblin and slashing at the other. Gendry put an arrow past him into the wounded goblin's throat. It fell to the ground dead. The one on the floor aimed for Cazador's knees, but couldn't get through his armor. The warg went for his throat, but got his arm instead. Cazador removed the warg's ears with one axe, and a chunk of its chest with the other. The other beast and his riders went in for Sincat, landing the first blows for their side. Her eyes glowed, and a searing smite turned one goblin's chest into a smoking crater. Julian put a bolt into the wounded warg, dropping it. Peregrine rolled off the headboard and hit the grounded goblin in the back of the head, knocking it out cold. Gendry missed her next shot as the last warg turned and tried to flee. Cazador turned and fried both monster and rider with a blast from his jaws. The warg lived clear, only for Sincat and Julian to bring it down with a crossbow bolt and another blast of fire, this one tinged purple with hellish might. Sincat patched the wound in her shoulder, placing her hand over it. Golden light gleamed from beneath her hand, and she pulled it away. The wound was gone, not even a scar remaining thanks to the paladin's healing magics. Cazador put away his axes, and was confused to see the halfling with one of the goblins over his shoulder, setting a pot on the fire for tea. I ken ye wee scunners were hungry, but I nae ken ye'd even scuff goblins, he mentioned, his thick dwarvish accent raising a pair of eyebrows. I'm not going to eat him. There's not enough spices in the world to make it tasty. I'm making tea for both of us, Peregrine responded, not even batting an eye at the accent. Why exactly are you making the overgrown green rat tea? Gendry asked as she walked over, still confused. It's almost tea time, and tea is the best time for chatting. Annie, so you're going to interrogate him. I've never seen tea used as a torture device. Have you, Firebrand? Julian joked, mostly aimed at Sincat. The tiefling was unamused. Torture isn't my area of expertise, nor is it a halfling field of study. You're crazy. I'm just going to make him a cup, ask him a few questions, and send him on his way, Peregrine explained, as he poured a couple mugs and waved one to the goblin's nose to wake him up. Something smells good, the goblin murmured as he woke up, then started and looked around, freaking out slightly as he realized that he was surrounded by paladins. Oozle, this ain't Acheron. Nope, you're not dead yet. Care for some tea? After a brief conversation, they determined that the goblin, named Runtgut, was part of a rather large goblinoid war host that controlled the southernmost parts of the northern Goblin Garden, based out of an old abbey and led by Davos. Davos apparently recently took control of the pass by sending a small force to take over one of the old dwarven watchtowers, in order to catch any caravan coming through. Well, that won't do. I suppose that will have to be cleared, Peregrine said matter-of-factly. Care to come along and help? He asked the others. Julian shrugged. Well, it's in my way, swell. I'll help. His voice was slightly odd, more like you'd expect from a university lecturer rather than a warrior. It also had an accent, though it wasn't any one language, more like a dozen different ones, all running into one another to create an accent. There is evil, I will fight it, Sincat said calmly. The tiefling's voice was rather smooth and calming, but she spoke slightly awkwardly. Her comment was fine, but there was a tinge of distant lands about it. Likewise, Andrea offered her support with a nod towards the others. Enough standing around and babbling. And we've goblins to crush, and a road we can is on. Cazador rumbled, turning back towards the road. Runtgunt mentioned that there was a back way around that the wolf riders and bugbears took to flank. He could lead them there. Arguing ensued. Peregrine trusted it. Julian and Singhet were pragmatic about it and determined that it was likely a risk worth taking. Gendry and Cazador were flatly against it. Eventually, they determined to follow it, with the condition that the goblin was placed on a leash. Runtgut was not happy in the slightest about this. The party set out along a hidden path towards the main tower, Runtgut in the lead. They passed by an area thick with trees and shrubbery on one side and a cliff edge on the other. Gendry smelled something on the wind, an earthy stink, and her eyes went wide as she realized that they were passing by a bugbear den. 3 of the beasts leapt out of the bush, hitting Julian in the helmet. It became dented and was stuck on his face. Seneca was beat upon for the 2nd time that day, and Peregrine was used as a golf ball. Julian cursed as he reeled back, drawing his blade and striking the ambusher across the chest. Runtgut took this as a chance to leave and ran for it. Gendry pulled her sword from a hip and a dagger from her boot, slashing open the bugbear's face. Cazador, meanwhile, grabbed one of the lanky goblinoids by the beard and started dragging him towards the cliff. Peregrine rolled between his attacker's legs, kicked him in the jollies, and ran for the tree. Senket, getting quite tired of being beaten up, turned and delivered her morning star directly into the bugbear's face. "This is how you bludgeon someone, you oversized corpet!" The bugbear and Cazador's talons struggled, hold with him, but couldn't break free as they drew near the cliff edge. The 2nd put another dent in Julian's armor, and the 3rd chased the halfling into the trees. Julian and Gendry teamed up on their bugbear, attacking it from both sides. Senket moved to help Peregrine in, who clambered up a tree to keep his bugbear distraction. Senket walked up behind it, tapped it on the shoulder, and smashed its shoulder in. Cazador lifted the bugbear over his head and flung it from the cliff. The goblins survived the fall, much to Cazador's chagrin. The hairy creature turned to run, causing Cazador to hurl rocks and obscenities after it. Gendry heard him cursing, walked over, and shot the running bugbear in the back of the head. Cazador gave her the slightest of nods. "Nice shot, knife ears." "That's 2 for me and 1 for you, Scales." Julian heard noises in the bushes and investigated, coming upon the mace duel. Senket ordered him back, and Peregrine shouted encouragement from the trees. The infernal paladin showed the bugbear who the real master of Morningstar was by putting hers through its skull. The party continued on, and soon came upon the backside of the watchtower. It was surrounded by a small hobgoblin camp. Wolves relaxed between the tower and fences. Goblins walked around poorly built shacks. Hobgoblins, their larger, more intelligent cousins, came and went in and out of the tower. The party decided to fall back and waited until morning to attack, since the goblins would have an advantage in the dark. Peregrine decided to take the time to strike up a conversation. "So, you're a dragonborn with a dwarvish name, dwarvish accent, and a dwarven god on your chest. What happened? Wizard spell? Angry druid? Just happened to grow up 8 feet tall with a really weird skin condition?" Cazador chuckled slightly. "Hey, laddie, I'm Drakefoot hatched. Nae long ago the clan that would be mine was out of Holland home, driven out by a fell-red drake and his servants. The schooners who served me among them. When my lord came back and slew the old worm, the Drakefolk left me and me egg behind. My father had lost his son in the fighting, and so, when he found me and took me in, son for son, grudge for grudge, the Reese can't I'd be a warrior, so they told him to give me for clanging, and so is I am. And out here he sent me to take back the halls lost to goblins and worse." "How did you even fit in a dwarf hold?" Gendry asked. "They're a bit taller than you think," he answered. At this point they set up camp and rested, setting watches. Suncat continued to have the worst luck, as it was during her watch that the war riders started moving, heading out and moving onwards towards the party. She woke the party, and they pulled back to the bugbear area. Julian had the idea to pin back the young saplings here for a trap. He, Cazador, and Sinkat set up a tree each. Gendry climbed up a different tree and got out her bow, while Peregrine walked out into the middle of the road as bait. Soon enough, the enemy came. 3 3 wolves, with 6 goblins riding on their backs, 2 to a wolf, all headed in that direction. They moved to run down the stupid halfling, shouting jeers in their crude tongue. Snap! 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 3 trees came up, flinging 4 goblins off and slamming one particularly unlucky wolf in the face, flipping it over. An arrow from Yendri nailed a standing wolf, and it severely regretted its life choices, especially when 2 short swords leapt from their scabbards. Blades flashed in the moonlight, and a second later the wolf's head and body hit the ground with 2 wet thuds. Cazador rushed from the woods with surprising speed from his size, cleaving into goblins with fury, leaving one a bloody pulp. The survivor turned to flee, and Cazador moves to finish him with extreme contempt. Coward! 2 rushed Peregrine, driving him back with help from the other wolf, who took a chunk out of his slightly less than prodigious gut. But Sinket came to his aid, Morningstar and Shield knocking one goblin to the floor, then pulverizing it. Peregrine focused on the goblin still standing and landed a cut over her heart, but the wolf took a chunk from his leg. The wounded goblin looked as though she were about to take advantage and lay into his neck, but she stepped on the severed wolf's head and slipped, keeping her footing but going wide. 2 more rushed from the cover of the trees and fired poorly at Yendri. She ignored the amateurs, who wounded the fleeing goblin before he was able to get help. Julian cut one of the archers in half with a single mighty blow, and the remaining archer couldn't get through his armor, but Yendri could put an arrow through his shoulder. Julian finished him a moment later. Peregrine slashed off the goblin's hand, then drove her sword through her chest. You were pretty good. Almost had me, he said, slightly sadly, before the light died from her eyes. The bard hid the bodies in the bugbear's burrows, and Peregrine said a brief prayer over the bodies. Don't waste your words. Nerds, they're just goblins, Yendri told him. Oh, and nice job taking the lead, Kaz. Killing folk isn't a happy thing, even if they're wicked folk, Peregrine responded. In the morning they were up and looking at the watchtower. The hobs were busy searching all over for the goblins and licking their wounds. One hob with a particularly big axe cast healing magic, and another, dressed in mage's robes, headed inside the tower. The party decided that charging in would be suicide, so it was time to try her stealth again. Scouting around revealed a gap that the goblins had been throwing all their rubbish out of. Too big for a medium creature, but a small one. Peregrine was not happy as he successfully snuck into the camp and spied a weak point in the defenses, an area where only one guard was watching. Back down the chute, Cazador spotted something in the rubbish. It was a warhammer, the kind that normally was hung in a shrine in Moradin. He took it and looked very grave. Peregrine signaled to Yendri, who alerted Julian. Crossbow, longbow, and 2 short swords were aimed at one lonely, tired wall guard. He never stood a chance. With a boost from Cazador, the party got over and hauled the less than jolly red giant over after them. They slipped along the courtyard to the tower. Along the way, they saw the hobs had set up a small forge and were using an unusually ornate anvil. It didn't take a genius to realize where they'd stolen that anvil from. Cazador was boiling with rage, actually beginning to glow red-hot from the sheer force of his fury. The party successfully snuck into the watchtower and saw that the watchroom had been thoroughly looted, and what had once been a small shrine to Moradin had been replaced with a headsman's block, the skulls of dwarven occupants hanging over it. Cazador lost it, stormed out, grabbed a very surprised hobgoblin guard, and bellowed at him. Go get your priest. Tell him that Moradin's son has come to take his father's shrine back. Cazador stalked inside as the guard began to sound the alarm and waited, axes drawn. Sinket moved to throw the mechanism to slam shut the doors once the priest entered. The rest of the party prepared to head upstairs, taking up sniper missions, and also encountering some rather panicky hobs. The priest finally arrived, and saw exactly one paladin waiting for him, and walked forward. So, where's this so-called son of Moradin? All I see is a dead lizard. Where's the wee priest and the so-called grace to conquerors? All I see is a cowardly slave with a cowardly excuse for a deity who couldn't even beat one-eyed man without swapping him in bodies. After receiving this insult to both self and savior, the priest charged. Peregrine leapt upon the nearest hobgoblin, putting him down with 2 short swords in his stomach, the second surging, smiting dark, hard to make sure that the job was done. Yendri and Julian followed suit. Yendri's smite was less of an explosion and more a sudden crescent moon that bisected her target, while Julian's was a flare of violent crimson light, turning his victim into a fine red mist. Then they all heard movement from the third floor. Once the priest was through, Sinket threw the lever, and the dwarven door slammed shut. Cazador charged, and axes clashed, twin silver biting and cleaving into single blood-stained, neither goblin scale nor dwarven chain losing before the mutual onslaught. Sinket, on the other hand, was not getting involved. She did her head out of the window and summoned a spiritual weapon, whacking a hobgoblin with a ghostly mace. The hobmage looked down the stairs, saw the party, and hurled a fireball. The party scattered. Peregrine wasn't having any of it, and charged up the stairs, dashing in close enough to slash him with his offhand weapon. Yendri took cover and fired a shot, missing. Julian, on the other hand, charged, and delivered a smite directly into the goblin's bright blue nose. This deleted the mage from existence. Back on the ground floor, the priest summoned a phantom axe, which bit into Cazador's thigh. He answered with 2 axes in the hobgoblin's chest. Next, the hobgoblin retaliated with a strike that swept one of Cazador's axes out of his hand. Upstairs, the party spent the next few seconds healing off their sizable burns, while the hobgoblins outside attempted to batter down the door. Peregrine found some scrolls in the hobgoblin's satchel that he was unfortunately unable to read. Sinket continued using her phantom mace to keep whacking goblins while attempting to barricade the door. With his newly freed claw, Cazador grabbed the hobgoblin. The priest responded with axe, phantom, and physical, battering the stone fireball. Dragonborn. Yenri could identify the scrolls and quickly found a scroll of fireball. Meanwhile, Julian and Peregrine found to their horror that crossbowstring and leather strap don't handle being set on fire all that well. No, the door was beginning to crack, and Sink had informed Cazador of this. Cazador responded, "I'm a wee bit busy here, lassie." Cazador body slammed the priest into his own altar. Switching to the sacred hammer, he raised his arm high and brought it down with a smite. The sound of an anvil rang out as the priest was smashed into the chopping block with such force that it cracked. He struggled, axe striking, and prayers to his god growing ever more desperate. Peregrine, having more courage than good sense, defenestrated himself onto the back line of the startled hobgoblins, slaying 2. Yendri adjusted her aim slightly and unleashed our fireball into the front of the hobs, which also happened to be the straw that broke the watchtower's door, much to chagrin. And Julian watched the grazing halfly and simply uttered, "When in water deep," as he stepped to the ledge, 2 angelic wings sprouting from his back. Julian the Azamar descended, bringing death upon the hobgoblins. Cazador raised his hammer once more and bellowed out a war cry, "For Clegane!" Then, with a single blow, he shattered priest and altar in a flash of blinding light, and the bloody paladin turned to wreak further vengeance upon the trespassing goblins. Sinket turned to the goblins and raised her morning star, glowing with the light of the sun, as she charged forth and felled another. Fireballed, attacked on all sides, leaderless, and facing a batch of crazy zealots, the hobgoblins broke and ran. Although bloodied, the paladins were victorious. Yendru returned to inform the caravan, while the others rested and mended their wounds with what spells they had left. They looked onwards from the watchtower into the unknown northern garden, lands of untold bounty and countless histories, defiled and bent beneath the heels of great warlords of goblin kind and worse. Their adventure, nay, their crusade, was only beginning.